He slid a briefcase across the mahogany table. $1 million in crisp, unmarked bills. All hers, just to disappear into his gilded cage. But Chloe didn't reach for the money. Instead, she looked the most dangerous man in New York in the eye and asked for his empire. The neon sign of O'Rourke's diner buzzed with a frantic, dying energy, casting a flickering red glow over the rain-slicked pavements of Hell's Kitchen. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale grease, burned filter coffee, and the quiet desperation of the 2 a.m. shift. Chloe Jenkins stood behind the Formica counter, her broad back aching with a dull, familiar throb. She was a fat woman, and she carried her weight with a pragmatic, unapologetic heaviness. Her thighs chafed under the cheap polyester of her uniform, and the apron strings dug deeply into the soft, thick rolls of her waist. She had spent the last 8 hours navigating the narrow aisles of the diner, her large hips brushing against booths as she balanced trays heavily loaded with meatloaf and soggy fries. While society often treated her as invisible, a soft, round fixture meant only to serve. Chloe possessed a razor-sharp mind and an observant eye. She saw everything. She knew which cops took bribes from the local bookies, which politicians brought their mistresses to the corner booths, and exactly who the men in the tailored Italian suits were when they occupied the back section of O'Rourke's. Tonight, the back booth belonged to Dominic Valenti. Dominic was not a myth. He was a brutal reality. The FBI had a sprawling file on him at their Foley Square headquarters. He was the newly minted boss of a syndicate that had violently absorbed the remnants of the old Lucchese and Genovese operations. Dominic was 38, with eyes like cracked ice and a jawline covered in dark, coarse stubble. He didn't wear flashy jewelry like the mobsters of the Gotti era. He wore bespoke charcoal suits that hid the Kevlar underneath. Chloe was pouring a fresh pot of decaf when the bell above the diner door chimed. 2 men walked in. They were dressed in heavy, dark raincoats despite the mild September drizzle. Their eyes were frantic, darting instantly past the empty stools and locking dead onto the back booth where Dominic sat alone, stirring a cup of black coffee. Chloe had grown up in a rough neighborhood in the Bronx. She recognized the rigid posture of a man concealing a modified MAC-10 submachine gun. Time seemed to dilate, slowing to a thick, agonizing crawl. One of the men reached into his coat. Dominic, usually hyper-aware, was looking down at a burner phone. His guard momentarily dropped. Chloe didn't scream. She didn't freeze. Instinct, forged by a life of protecting herself and her younger sister, took over. She held a heavy glass coffee pot filled with scalding hot, fresh brewed French roast. With surprising agility for a woman of her size, Chloe pivoted on her worn, orthotic shoes and hurled the boiling pot directly at the first gunman's face. The glass shattered against the man's cheekbone with a sickening crunch. Boiling dark liquid exploded over his eyes and neck. He shrieked, a high-pitched, guttural sound of pure agony, his hands flying to his blistering face as he blindly squeezed the trigger. Rat, tat, tat, tat. Gunfire erupted, shattering the diner's front windows and tearing chunks of cheap plaster from the ceiling. "Get down," Chloe roared. Using her formidable mass and momentum, she launched herself forward, tackling Dominic Valenti out of the booth. Dominic grunted violently as Chloe's heavy body slammed into him, driving him down to the sticky linoleum floor, just as a line of bullets chewed through the leather upholstery where his head had been a fraction of a second prior. She didn't stay on top of him. She rolled them both behind the reinforced steel foundation of the industrial deep fryers. "Stay down, you idiot," Chloe hissed, her chest heaving, pressing her large, soft frame against the greasy steel. Dominic, recovering from the shock, stared at her. For a man accustomed to waif-thin supermodels and terrified subordinates, the sheer, solid reality of the woman panting beside him was disorienting. Her face was flushed, her dark hair escaping its messy bun, but her eyes were entirely devoid of fear. They were feral. The second hitman, realizing they had lost the element of surprise and that police sirens were already wailing in the distance, grabbed his screaming partner by the collar. The two men stumbled out into the rainy night, leaving the diner in a state of smoking, shattered ruin. For a long moment, the only sound was the bubbling of the fryer oil and the heavy breathing of the two people hiding behind it. Dominic slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position, brushing shards of glass from his expensive wool trousers. He looked at the bullet holes tearing through his booth, then turned his icy gaze back to the fat waitress in the stained apron. "You just saved my life," Dominic stated, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the small space. "You're leaving a 400% tip, buddy," Chloe snapped back, her hands shaking as the adrenaline began to recede, leaving her cold. She struggled to push her heavy body off the floor. Dominic stood and offered her a hand. Chloe looked at his manicured, powerful fingers, then ignored them, grabbing the edge of the counter to hoist herself up. Dominic's eyes darkened, a flicker of genuine intrigue breaking through his usually impenetrable facade. He pulled a thick money clip from his pocket, threw a stack of $100 bills onto the ruined counter, easily $5,000, and stepped closer to her. "What's your name?" he asked softly, the scent of expensive cologne mixing with the smell of gunpowder. "Chloe. Now get out before the cops get here. I don't want to explain why a mob boss is bleeding on my floor." Dominic didn't smile, but a shadow of amusement crossed his face. He turned and walked out into the rain, disappearing into the shadows of Hell's Kitchen. Chloe stared at the blood and the money, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She thought the nightmare was over. She was wrong. It was only just beginning. 72 hours later, Chloe's life had systematically unraveled. First, O'Rourke's was permanently closed for renovations, a polite term for a crime scene that had been thoroughly cleansed by men who didn't carry police badges. Then Chloe received a polite but firm eviction notice from her landlord on her tiny, rent-stabilized apartment in Queens. Finally, a pair of dark SUVs had boxed in her 10-year-old Honda Civic as she was leaving a visit to Mount Sinai Hospital, where her sister was receiving expensive, uninsured treatments for severe lupus. Two men in suits had escorted her into the back of a tinted Lincoln Navigator. They hadn't touched her, but the implication was clear. Now, Chloe found herself sitting in the private dining room of Il Mulino in Greenwich Village. The restaurant was officially closed to the public, the front doors locked, the curtains drawn. The table was set with heavy crystal and polished silver. Dominic Valenti sat across from her. In the harsh light of the chandelier, he looked even more intimidating. He poured a glass of Barolo wine and slid it toward her. Chloe didn't touch it. She sat rigidly in the plush velvet chair, hyper-aware of how her wide hips spilled slightly over the edges of the seat. But she kept her chin high, her dark eyes locked onto his. "Your sister's medical bills at Mount Sinai," Dominic began, his voice smooth, businesslike. "Totaling roughly $140,000. You're facing eviction. You have no job, Chloe." "And whose fault is that?" she fired back, her voice dripping with venom. "I was doing just fine before you brought a hit squad into my diner." Dominic chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. You have a remarkably distorted view of just fine. You were working yourself to death for minimum wage. But you showed loyalty. You showed courage. In my world, those currencies are priceless. He reached down to the floor beside him and lifted an aluminum Halliburton briefcase. He placed it squarely on the table between them and popped the latches. Click. Click. He turned the case around and opened the lid. Chloe's breath hitched in her throat. The case was packed solidly with stacks of used, non-sequential $50 and $100 bills. It was a sea of green, a physical manifestation of absolute freedom. $1 million, Dominic stated plainly. Tax-free, untraceable. Chloe stared at the money. Her mind immediately flashed to her sister's pale face in the hospital bed. This money meant the best doctors, the best care. It meant a house with a garden instead of a moldy apartment. It meant she would never have to strap on a greasy apron or endure the mocking stares of customers who viewed her weight as a punchline. "What's the catch?" Chloe asked, her voice trembling slightly. She wasn't stupid. Men like Dominic Valenti didn't give away fortunes out of charity. Dominic leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his eyes tracing the soft, round curves of her face, the fullness of her lips, the heavy rise and fall of her chest. "I have enemies, Chloe. The men who attacked me belong to a splinter faction operating out of Staten Island. They know what you did. They know you interfered. You aren't safe on the streets." He paused, his gaze darkening with a possessive intensity. "You will take this money. You will move into a penthouse I own on the Upper East Side. It has heavy security. You will not leave without my men. You will be provided for, completely. You will be mine." The silence in the room was deafening. Chloe processed the offer. $1 million, safety for her sister, a luxurious life. But the cost was absolute submission. She would be a pet, a captive bird in a very expensive, very dangerous cage. She knew the reality of women connected to the mafia. They ended up isolated, paranoid, and eventually entirely disposable. He wanted her because she was different, because her thick, soft body and fierce spirit fascinated him. But fascination always fades. A cold, hard resolve crystallized in Chloe's chest. The fear vanished, replaced by a calculated, desperate audacity. She reached out with a plump, steady hand, grasped the lid of the briefcase, and slammed it shut with a resounding crack. Dominic's eyes widened in genuine shock. The guard standing by the door shifted uneasily, hands instinctively drifting toward their jackets. "No," Chloe said, her voice entirely flat. "No?" Dominic echoed, leaning back slowly, the temperature in the room seeming to drop 10 degrees. "You're declining $1 million and my protection? You realize you will likely be dead by the end of the week." "I'm declining the cage," Chloe said, leaning forward now, matching his posture. "I don't want to be your kept woman, Dominic. I don't want to sit in a penthouse waiting for you to decide you're bored of the fat girl you thought was brave." "Then what do you want?" he asked, his voice laced with a dangerous edge. "I want a seat at the table," Chloe demanded. The guards at the door actually laughed. Dominic silenced them with a single, lethal glance. He looked back at Chloe, studying her to see if she had lost her mind. "Explain," he ordered. "You're bleeding money, Dominic," Chloe said, her mind working furiously, piecing together years of overheard diner conversations and local neighborhood gossip. "The feds are cracking down on your traditional money laundering fronts. The construction unions are heavily monitored. Your sanitation contracts are being audited by the IRS. Dominic's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. How do you know this? Because I listen. While your capos were eating my meatloaf, they talked. They thought I was just a stupid, fat waitress who couldn't comprehend high finance. But I have a degree in accounting that I couldn't finish paying for. Chloe tapped her manicured fingernail against the top of the aluminum briefcase. You don't need a pet, Dominic. You need a ghost. You need someone clean. She took a deep breath, laying her cards on the table. Keep your $1 million. Instead, you are going to buy a high-end corporate catering company. It's a cash-heavy business, massive overhead, perfectly positioned for inflated invoices. I will run it. I will launder your syndicate's money through it. It will provide the perfect cover for your top-tier meetings disguised as private tasting events. Dominic stared at her, completely motionless. If I am your captive mistress, I am a vulnerability, Chloe continued, her voice gaining strength, the sheer adrenaline of the gamble fueling her. If I am your business partner, I am indispensable. I control the money flow. It makes me untouchable to your enemies, because taking me out means destroying your financial pipeline. And it makes me equal to you. Dominic Valenti, a man who had orchestrated the downfall of rival bosses and commanded hundreds of violent men, sat perfectly still. He looked at the soft, heavy-set woman sitting across from him. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She had just looked down the barrel of the Mafia and demanded a controlling share. A slow, terrifying smile spread across Dominic's face. A catering company, he murmured, the words rolling off his tongue. With full executive control, Chloe countered. My sister gets her treatments paid for as an employee health benefit, completely above board. And I answer only to you, not your underboss, not your capos, only you. Dominic slowly stood up. He walked around the large mahogany table until he was standing directly beside her chair. Chloe forced herself not to shrink away. He leaned down, his face inches from hers, the heat of his body radiating against her cheek. You are playing a very dangerous game, Chloe Jenkins, he whispered softly. If you steal from me, if you make a mistake, I won't just kill you. I will dismantle everything you love, piece by piece. I don't make mistakes, she whispered back, staring into his icy eyes. Dominic straightened up. He looked at the briefcase, then back at her. Draw up the business plan, the Mafia Boss commanded. You have 48 hours. 6 months later, Apex Corporate Catering was unequivocally the most sought-after culinary service in Manhattan. Operating out of a massive, state-of-the-art industrial kitchen in Chelsea, the company handled exclusive charity galas, billionaire corporate retreats, and high-society weddings. To the outside world, the society pages, and the elite clientele, Chloe Jenkins was a brilliant, self-made entrepreneur who had aggressively shattered the glass ceiling of New York's hospitality industry. To the FBI financial analysts, endlessly scrutinizing the books of local syndicates, she was an absolute ghost. Chloe sat in her glass-walled corner office, reviewing the quarterly ledgers on dual monitors. She wore a tailored, crimson designer blazer that perfectly accentuated her thick, hourglass figure, paired with a black pencil skirt that hugged her wide hips. Her sister, Sarah, was currently resting comfortably in a private suite at Mount Sinai Hospital, her aggressive top-tier treatments fully funded by Apex's premium corporate healthcare plan. Chloe had kept her promise. The syndicate's dirty money flowed smoothly into the catering business through heavily inflated invoices for imported truffles, beluga caviar, rare wines, and phantom waitstaff. The cash was scrubbed spotless, and deposited legally into Dominic Valenti's legitimate real estate holdings. A heavy, authoritative knock on the frosted glass broke her intense concentration. Dominic walked in without waiting for an invitation. He wore a midnight blue Brioni suit, his dark, calculating eyes instantly locking onto her. Over the past 6 months, their strictly professional relationship had morphed into a high-stakes, agonizing dance of power and deeply repressed desire. He respected her lethal intellect and ruthless efficiency, but his gaze often lingered with heavy intent on the soft, heavy curves she no longer tried to hide beneath cheap polyester diner uniforms. "The laundering efficiency is up by 14% this month," Chloe stated flatly, tapping her manicured nail against the screen. She didn't look up immediately, refusing to show him how his mere presence instantly accelerated her pulse. Dominic walked around her large mahogany desk, invading her personal space with deliberate slowness. The intoxicating scent of bergamot, expensive leather, and unspoken danger enveloped her. He leaned over, placing one large hand flat on the desk, the other resting lightly on the high back of her leather chair. "I didn't come all the way down here to discuss the profit margins, Chloe." His deep voice vibrated near her ear, sending a treacherous shiver down her spine. "Carmine Rossi is making a move." Chloe froze, her fingers halting over the keyboard. Carmine the Butcher. Rossi was the brutal, unpredictable architect of the Staten Island faction. He was the man who had originally ordered the hit at O'Rourke's diner to test Dominic's defenses. "Rossi's men have been violently strong-arming our sanitation contracts in Brooklyn," Dominic continued, his jaw tightening into a hard line. "My informants inside his crew say he knows about Apex. He knows you are the architect of my new financial structure. You are no longer just a business partner, Chloe. You have become a high-value target." Chloe turned her chair to face him, forcing him to step back slightly to accommodate her knees. She looked up at him, her dark eyes fiercely determined, completely devoid of the fear he was accustomed to seeing in others. "I'm not hiding in a heavily guarded penthouse, Dominic. I told you that on day one. We built a fortress here. The security system in this building rivals the Pentagon. Technology can be bypassed, and guards can be bought," Dominic countered, his voice rough and laced with an unfamiliar urgency. He reached out, his thumb gently, almost reverently, tracing the soft line of her jaw. It was the first time he had touched her so intimately since the diner. A jolt of pure electricity shot down Chloe's spine, making her breath catch. "I will not let Rossi touch you," Dominic whispered, a dangerous, absolute vow. "You are the most valuable asset I have ever possessed." Chloe batted his hand away, though it cost her every ounce of iron willpower she possessed. "I am a partner, not a possession, Dominic. Don't confuse the two. If Rossi wants to come for the Queen, he better not miss." Dominic smirked, a predatory, admiring gleam flashing in his icy eyes. He liked her defiance. He craved it. "Tomorrow night is the mayoral charity gala at the Waldorf Astoria. Apex is catering. Rossi knows all my top capos will be attending under the guise of legitimate businessmen, alongside the mayor and the governor. It is a massive, crowded venue. It is the perfect opportunity for him to strike." Chloe stood up. In her expensive heels, she was imposing. A formidable, substantial woman who commanded the room entirely through her presence and intellect. "Then we don't cancel," Chloe declared coldly. "We use the gala as a trap. Let him come. I control the venue. I control the staff. I control the physical layout of the entire ballroom. I will serve Carmine Rossi his final meal. Dominic studied her, a potent mixture of awe, respect, and dark desire swirling in his gaze. He nodded slowly, authorizing the play. Draft the tactical layout. Send it to my encrypted server. My best men will pose as your sous chefs, valets, and waiters. As he turned to leave, he paused at the heavy glass door, looking back over his shoulder. Wear the black dress tomorrow night, Chloe. The silk one. He left before she could formulate a response, leaving her alone in the cold, air-conditioned office with a burning, undeniable heat pooling deeply in her stomach. The Waldorf Astoria Grand Ballroom was a sweeping masterpiece of gilded elegance, imported orchids, and cascading crystal chandeliers. 500 of New York's elite, hedge fund managers, politicians, and socialites mingled, sipping vintage champagne, blissfully unaware that a brutal mob war was quietly simmering beneath the silver platters of prime beef Wellington. Chloe stood near the heavy, swinging kitchen doors, intensely surveying her domain. She wore the black silk dress Dominic had requested. It was custom-tailored, clinging perfectly to her wide hips and heavy bust, the rich, dark fabric draping elegantly over the soft roundness of her stomach. She looked powerful, profoundly beautiful, and exceptionally dangerous. An earpiece buzzed sharply in her left ear. "Perimeter secure," whispered Tony, Dominic's ruthlessly efficient chief enforcer. Tony was currently dressed in a crisp, white executive chef's coat, a heavily modified, suppressed Glock 19 hidden seamlessly beneath his apron. Dominic sat at a sprawling VIP table near the front stage, flanked by the city's political heavyweights and 3 of his most trusted capos in tuxedos. He caught Chloe's eye across the massive, crowded room. He didn't smile, but he offered a barely perceptible, reassuring nod. The tension in the room was suffocating, thick enough to carve with a steak knife. Chloe walked briskly back into the bustling, cavernous kitchen. Legitimate chefs shouted rapid-fire orders. Heavy copper pans sizzled with searing meats, and the rich scent of rosemary, roasted garlic, and reduction sauces filled the humid air. She walked over to the central prep island and checked the master inventory tablet, her eyes flying over the digital spreadsheets. Something was wrong. Her razor-sharp accounting mind instantly caught the subtle discrepancy in the logistics software. The digital manifest showed that 24 Apex catering vans had officially arrived and parked at the underground loading dock, but she had only authorized and dispatched 22. "Tony," Chloe whispered urgently into her lapel microphone, walking quickly toward the rear service elevators, away from the civilian kitchen staff. "We have a critical breach. 2 unauthorized delivery vehicles bypassed the dock security using cloned transponders. Check the service corridors on the east wing immediately." "Copy that. Moving," Tony replied, his voice deadly calm. Chloe didn't wait in the kitchen. She grabbed a heavy, solid brass meat tenderizer from an unattended butcher's prep station. She slipped through the double doors and into the dim, narrow concrete hallway that ran directly behind the main kitchen, a labyrinth used only by service staff and maintenance. Her heart pounded furiously against her ribs. She was a millionaire CEO now, rubbing elbows with the mayor, but the gritty, violent survival instincts forged in the poverty of the Bronx never truly faded. As she silently rounded the corner, she saw them. 3 men, wearing crisp Apex catering uniforms, but their posture was rigid, and their footwear was entirely wrong. They wore black tactical combat boots, not non-slip kitchen shoes. They were frantically pulling short-barreled, fully automatic assault rifles from the bottom of a heavy canvas laundry cart. They weren't heading for the main ballroom to shoot Dominic directly. They were heading straight for the central electrical grid room at the end of the hall to cut the master power. If the lights went out in the windowless ballroom, the ensuing panic would turn the gala into an uncontrollable slaughterhouse. Chloe didn't hesitate. She stepped out from the shadows, raised her arm, and hurled the solid brass tenderizer with terrifying, desperate accuracy. The heavy metal tool struck the lead gunman square in the temple with a sickening crack. He dropped instantly, his body hitting the carpeted floor like a stone, his rifle clattering uselessly against the wall. The other two hitmen spun around, their eyes wide with shock, violently raising their weapons toward the woman in the black silk dress. But Chloe was already moving. Using her momentum and formidable weight, she dove hard behind a massive stack of reinforced steel banquet tables, just as a deafening volley of silenced bullets chewed viciously into the drywall exactly where she had been standing a second before. "Kitchen hallway, east wing. They're going for the power grid, now!" Chloe screamed into her radio, covering her head as plaster rained down on her. Heavy pounding footsteps thundered rapidly down the corridor from the opposite end. Tony and 4 of Dominic's men, still wearing their pristine white aprons, rounded the corner in flawless tactical formation with their weapons drawn and leveled. A brief, vicious, terrifying firefight erupted in the narrow, echoing space. It lasted less than 12 seconds. When the gunsmoke finally cleared, settling like a fog over the carpet, Carmine Rossi's elite hitmen were dead on the floor. In the distant ballroom, the classical string quartet continued to play a flawless rendition of Vivaldi, entirely undisturbed by the silenced violence that had just saved hundreds of lives. Chloe stayed crouched behind the steel tables, her chest heaving, her hands shaking violently. The sharp, metallic scent of fresh blood mixed sickeningly with the smell of expensive roasted meats wafting from the kitchen. Strong, desperate hands suddenly gripped her shoulders, hauling her up from the floor. It was Dominic. He had abandoned his VIP table and his political guests the absolute second he heard her scream over the encrypted radio channel. His usually icy, impenetrable eyes were wild, frantically scanning her thick, beautiful body for any signs of injury or blood. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a raw, terrifying vulnerability he had never shown to a single living soul. "No," Chloe gasped, her breathing jagged. She firmly brushed the white plaster dust off her black silk dress, forcing her spine straight. "I told you, Dominic. I control the venue." Dominic stared at her, the sheer adrenaline and overwhelming relief entirely shattering his ironclad emotional control. He didn't care about the dead men bleeding on the carpet. He didn't care about the governor sitting 50 feet away. He grabbed Chloe forcefully by the waist, pulling her heavy, soft body firmly and undeniably against his hard chest, and crushed his mouth to hers. The kiss was brutal, breathless, passionate, and deeply possessive. It was a collision of power and survival. Chloe surrendered to it entirely, wrapping her arms tightly around his broad shoulders, tasting the raw danger and absolute power on his lips. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, the air between them supercharged. "Rossi is done," Dominic growled softly, resting his forehead intimately against hers, his hands refusing to release her waist. "My men are heavily hitting his Staten Island compound right this second. The entire faction is being dismantled. It is over." Chloe looked deep into his eyes, now burning with unquestionable devotion and a fierce, terrifying love. She hadn't just survived the lethal world of the Mafia. She had conquered it. She hadn't meekly accepted the golden cage of a kept mistress. She had forcefully demanded the crown, and proved she was worthy of wearing it. "Good," Chloe whispered, her voice finally steadying. She reached up, straightening his crooked silk tie with a precise hand. "Because we have a very expensive blackberry tart dessert course to serve in exactly 5 minutes, and Apex Corporate Catering does not tolerate delays." She turned on her heel and walked back toward the kitchen doors. The absolute, undisputed queen of a dark, sprawling empire, leaving the most dangerous man in New York watching her walk away, completely and utterly mesmerized. And there you have it, the thrilling conclusion to Chloe's journey from a dismissed diner waitress to the reigning queen of a criminal empire. She proved that true power isn't handed to you in a briefcase. It's taken with intellect, courage, and unyielding self-worth. If you loved this intense mafia romance story and want more jaw-dropping twists, be sure to smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out.